Alright guys, the Total War series has long balanced between two distinct identities. On the one hand, you have the historical games, grounded in recreating the past, letting players step into the shoes of great civilizations and experiencing the sweep of history. On the other, you have the fantasy branch, most notably of course with the Warhammer trilogy, which embraces myth, spectacle, and asymmetry. The Warhammer games have been hugely successful, both critically and commercially, and they've changed the direction of Creative Assembly as a studio. But that success has also had significant consequences for how CA designs and approaches its historical games. What once set them apart from the fantasy titles has gradually been eroded, with more and more mechanics, systems, and design philosophies lifted directly from Warhammer and applied to the historical games. In this video, I want to explore how the Warhammer design ethos has shaped the last several historical entries, most notably of course Troy, Three Kingdoms, and Pharaoh, and why these shifts have often worked against what made historical Total War games unique in the first place. From the focus on faction leaders over cultures, the move towards faction-specific mechanics at the expense of shared systems, or the stagnation of tactical depth on the battlefield, so much about the historical side has lost its original charm. Let's find out why. One of the clearest shifts in design philosophy has been how CA frames campaign gameplay. In the older historical games, factions were defined by their place in history. Rome was Rome, Carthage was Carthage, Sparta was Sparta, not because of individual characters at the helm, but because of the cultural, political, and geographic identity of the people. The player's role was to step into the shoes of an entire civilization, managing it across centuries, guiding it through war, diplomacy, trade, and cultural development. The sense of immersion came not from role-playing one leader's story, but from the weight of history itself and the open-ended choices you could make. With Warhammer, however, Creative Assembly built campaigns around legendary lords. The central hook of each playthrough was the identity, story, and mechanics of a single character. When this was transplanted into the historical titles, the result was a narrowing of focus. In Troy, for example, your campaign hinged on playing Agamemnon, Achilles, Hector, or another key figure. Their traits and scripted story events dictated much of the campaign experience. Instead of feeling like you were shaping the destiny of an entire culture, you were locked into the motivations and quirks of one historical or even mythical figure. And this has significant consequences for player agency. That's really the point here. When your campaign identity is tied to a leader's predetermined motivations, much of the depth and freedom of choice that once defined historical Total War evaporates. You are no longer asking, what kind of Rome do I want to build, but rather, how do I role-play Achilles as CA has defined him? This fundamentally changes the experience from strategic sandbox to guided character campaign, which might work in fantasy games but clashes with the authenticity and breadth historical fans expect. It also erodes historical immersion. Ancient empires weren't built on the whims of one individual alone. They were shaped by collective cultures, evolving institutions, and the complex push and pull of societal forces. By reducing the campaign to the personality of one leader, the games strip away the nuance and systemic weight that made earlier titles resonate. Instead of being about civilizations, the games became about characters, and in that process, much of the historical authenticity was lost. Another design philosophy lifted from Warhammer is the reliance on unique faction-specific mechanics. In Warhammer, this makes sense. Each race and legendary lord should feel fantastical and wildly different from the others. Vampire counts play differently from dwarfs, and Skaven are unlike high elves. The asymmetry is part of the fantasy appeal. But when this is applied to historical titles as they have been, this approach undermines the strategic foundations that made the series compelling. Historically, civilizations all shared the same broad challenges: managing economies, fielding armies, engaging in diplomacy, expanding trade, and dealing with religion, culture, and unrest. What set factions apart was how these systems interacted with geography, neighbors, and unique rosters, not entirely new, bespoke mechanics for each faction. Take Troy again as the example. Every single faction leader here was given a very distinct mechanic, and while this might add flavor in the short term, it also fragments the campaign structure. Instead of each playthrough being defined by how you interact with the universal systems, economy, diplomacy, warfare, etc., your experience is dominated by the quirks of faction-specific mechanics. The result is that campaigns don't feel like emergent histories, but like pre-scripted role-playing exercises. This shift, of course, also reduces replayability. In older titles, you could play the same campaign map dozens of times as different factions and always encounter a new story, not because the mechanics were different, but because the circumstances, geography, and AI behaviors produced fresh challenges. Now, replayability is locked into mechanical novelty. You play Achilles once, you've seen all he offers. There's little incentive to return unless you want to role-play his story again. By focusing too heavily on unique mechanics for each of these factions, Creative Assembly has hollowed out the universal systems that gave their games systemic depth. Economy, politics, religion, and diplomacy should feel weighty and interconnected across all factions, providing a foundation that makes each campaign dynamic and unpredictable. Instead, the design ethos imported from Warhammer has left many historical campaigns feeling shallow, disjointed, and reliant on gimmicks rather than deep systems. Now, the consequences of Warhammer's influence aren't limited to the campaign map either. They've also seeped into the battles. Historically, one of the series' great strengths was the evolution of tactical complexity. From Shogun to Rome, medieval to Empire, each new title introduced new layers: line infantry, gunpowder, naval warfare, fortifications, supply, terrain effects. By the time of Empire and Rome 2, battles had grown to include dozens of interlocking systems that rewarded careful planning and adaptive strategy. But in recent years, that innovation has stagnated as well. Warhammer's battles are flashy, cinematic, and filled with spectacle. Yes, there is some tactical depth depending on whether you're using this kind of wizard or this beast, but it has been simplified across the board compared to the older historical titles. Much of the gameplay comes down to unit abilities, monster charges, and visual drama, rather than nuanced maneuvering. When Creative Assembly imported this approach into the historical games, tactical variety began to erode. Pharaoh is probably the most recent and starkest example of this. Its battles feel eerily similar to Rome 2 despite a decade of potential innovation since that release. Mechanics such as flanking, morale, and fatigue remain, but the depth has not evolved meaningfully. There are few innovations in terrain use, few significant advancements in siege design especially, and very little that feels like a leap forward in tactical simulation. In fact, I think most people will agree battles often feel like a step backwards, faster, less deliberate, and more about flashy, quick animations than layered tactical decision-making. The stagnation here is particularly frustrating because older games proved the potential for deep tactical systems. Empire introduced combined arms with muskets and artillery, Shogun 2 perfected unit cohesion and morale interplay, Rome 2, after patches of course, developed meaningful siege dynamics. By contrast, Pharaoh battles recycle systems with minimal advancement. The result is a sense that the historical side of Total War has plateaued, while all the energy for battle innovation has been channeled into maintaining and innovating Warhammer's spectacle. If there is a single turning point where Creative Assembly began applying the Warhammer design template to historical games, it was Troy. Marketed as part of the Saga series, Troy leaned heavily on mythical elements, heroes, and legendary stories. Its campaigns revolved around character-driven mechanics, not civilizational development. Each leader had their own gimmicks, heavily inspired by Warhammer's asymmetry, and the campaign structure felt more like role-playing than strategy. Three Kingdoms, the next historical game after Troy, interestingly struck a more balanced approach. While it leaned on characters and relationships, it also incorporated deep systems of diplomacy, economy, and empire management. It gave players choices about how romanticized or realistic they wanted their campaigns to be, finding a middle ground between myth and history. This balance made 3K probably one of the most well-received historical titles in recent years. But Total War Pharaoh, when it first launched, launched, doubled down on the Warhammer-inspired direction. Despite its rich setting in the Bronze Age collapse, the mechanics leaned heavily on character identity, scripted events, and faction-specific mechanics. The broader systems, economy, trade, diplomacy were thin, and battles felt like a direct copy of Rome 2. For many fans, Pharaoh felt like a missed opportunity, another attempt to mimic Warhammer's success rather than deliver the depth and systemic authenticity historical fans crave. This trajectory demonstrates a very clear pattern to me. After Warhammer's rise, CA began redesigning its historical games in the fantasy mold. Three Kingdoms proved it was possible to blend both identities successfully, but Troy and Pharaoh showed what happens when the balance tips too far towards character-driven Warhammer-style design. The result has been historical games that feel hollow, shallow, and lacking in the systemic depth that once defined this series. Probably for me, the most damaging influence here has been on the core campaign systems: economy, technology, resources, trading, and diplomacy. These were once the backbone of historical Total War, giving campaigns weight, consequence, and unpredictability. In Medieval 2, for example, trade routes could define your empire's strength. In Empire, managing colonies and global trade networks was central to survival. Diplomacy mattered deeply, with alliances, betrayals, and shifting balances of power shaping every campaign. Since Troy, however, these systems have been dramatically simplified. The economy often boils down to resource gimmicks tied to specific factions and regions rather than complex networks of trade, taxation, and management. Diplomacy has become shallow, with predictable AI behaviors and limited tools for negotiation. Technology trees are generic, offering little meaningful choice between unlocking the next thing or this buff. Resource systems have been connected to real geography and do feed into your technology, your buildings, your unit recruitment, etc., but it has led to less strategic importance overall as you go through your campaign, not more, existing only as scripted levers to power faction-specific mechanics. This simplification reflects directly on Warhammer's influence here. In a fantasy setting, you don't need deep interconnected systems. You need clear, accessible mechanics that differentiate factions. But for a historical setting, this lack of systemic depth strips away immersion and strategy. The choices you make as a player no longer feel weighty or consequential. Whether you're playing as Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the broader structures of your campaign feel the same because the core systems lack complexity. The tragedy here is that older titles proved how compelling these systems can be. Diplomacy in Three Kingdoms, trade in Empire, religion and culture in Medieval 2. All of these added richness and consequences to every decision you made. Since Troy, that richness has been drained, replaced by thin Warhammer-style mechanics that fail to capture the depth of history. Probably one of the most overlooked consequences of Warhammer's success has been the way CA reorientated their idea of who the Total War audience really is. Before the fantasy trilogy, the historical series catered primarily to players who wanted immersion in a time period, fans who wanted to command the legions of Rome, wage religious wars as medieval kings, or build an empire of trade and colonies across the 18th century. These games spoke to players who valued grounded cultural storytelling, a certain level of simulation, and the sense that the historical stage itself was the main character. With Warhammer, however, a new and very different audience entered the fold. Many players who had little interest in history became engaged with Total War because of its fantasy license, its colorful unit rosters, and its factional flavor built around heroes and villains. This was a massive commercial victory, of course, and understandably, Creative Assembly wanted to hold on to this new demographic. The problem is that in pivoting towards this audience, the studio began to change the very DNA of how they approach design in their historical games. As we've explored, we can see this shift most clearly in Troy and Pharaoh and, in Three Kingdoms as well. The marketing and presentation of these games show CA's assumption that historical players wanted the same kind of streamlined, character-driven mechanics that Warhammer fans enjoyed, but this was a miscalculation. The old Total War fanbase valued slow-burn complexity, emergent systems that rewarded patience, and a degree of authenticity that gave weight to their campaign. campaigns. Instead, these newer historicals leaned into flavor mechanics, gimmicks designed to make each faction feel superficially distinct, but which lacked the deep, universal systems that encouraged mastery over multiple playthroughs. The danger in this audience targeting shift is twofold. First, it alienates long-term historical players who have supported the series for decades. I mean, we've been here for a long time. When a Rome 2 or a Medieval 2 fan picks up Pharaoh, they don't see the continuity of the series they loved. They see a historical skin draped over a Warhammer-like experience. Second, the new audience that Warhammer brought in doesn't necessarily follow Creative Assembly into historical titles. Many of those players are there for the fantasy, the spectacle, and the rich Warhammer lore. They aren't really waiting with bated breath for the next grounded historical entry. Yes, there is some overlap, of course, but it isn't that big, and I think that CA has made the mistaken assumption of thinking that it is much larger than they think. The result is that historical games since Warhammer have ended up caught in a no man's land. They don't satisfy the historical purists, and they don't fully capture the fantasy fans either. Instead of creating two parallel series with distinct identities, CA seems to be trying to funnel one audience into the other, which dilutes the appeal of both. This shift in targeting is probably one of the root causes behind why Troy and Pharaoh at launch felt so unfocused, and why so many players have walked away from recent historical titles with disappointment. Now, closely tied to the issue of audience targeting is a deeper problem, the question of identity. Total War Warhammer thrives because it knows exactly what it is, a fantasy sandbox where legendary lords lead unique armies, magic and monsters dominate the battlefield, and every campaign is a clash of personalities as much as a clash of armies. The vision here is very clear and consistent, and that's why the trilogy works. But the new historical games simply do not share this clarity. Instead, games like Troy and Pharaoh sit in an awkward space, unsure whether to lean into grounded historical simulation or adopt the exaggerated story-driven flavor of Warhammer. This lack of identity creates a kind of confusion in both story and design, where the player is never quite sure what experience the game is trying to deliver. Take Troy as an example. It sold itself as a Total War saga, rooted in the Trojan War, a legendary event where myth and history intertwine. On paper, this should have been fascinating and very interesting to play, but in execution, it landed in a muddled middle ground. Heroes were larger than life, their mechanics dominated the campaigns, and the line between history and myth was blurred in a way that satisfied neither camp. Total War Pharaoh, despite the Dynasties update which made some really positive changes, does show the same confusion. CA did market it as a return to history, but the design betrays something else. Leaders dominate the narrative, systems are simplified and streamlined in ways that echo Warhammer, not Rome 2 or the older games. The core fantasy of ruling an ancient civilization and navigating its cultural, political, and social dynamics takes a backseat to mechanics that feel surface level, as if they were borrowed from another game entirely. The result is that the game doesn't know what it wants to be, a serious historical strategy game or a lighter Warhammer-inspired character sandbox. This identity crisis also affects how the story of these games are told. Older historical Total Wars did not need elaborate cutscenes or character arcs to make the player feel part of history. The story was written by the player's actions, by the rise and fall of empires, by the decisions made in moments of pressure. In Rome 1 and Medieval 2, the story was the campaign itself, the string of decisions that you are making. But in Troy and Pharaoh, Creative Assembly seems to want to tell you the story of the leaders rather than let you create your own story through the natural unfolding of the campaign. Essentially, this confusion of identity is not a small detail. It is central to why these recent games feel so unsatisfying. Players are being sold one thing, a historical Total War game, but the design choices deliver another, a kind of hybrid experiment that does not commit strongly to either direction. I think that until CA resolves this tension, their historical series will remain stuck in this fog of uncertainty, neither fulfilling the legacy of their past nor forging a bold new path forward. Altogether, I think the influence of Warhammer on Creative Assembly's historical games is pretty clear and undeniable. By leaning into character-driven campaigns, faction-specific mechanics, simplified overall systems, and recycled battle battle mechanics, CA has drifted away from what made the historical series so unique. Instead of strategic sandboxes defined by emergent history and deep systemic interaction, we now get role-playing experiences that mimic the Warhammer model, often at the cost of depth and immersion and replayability. Total War 3 Kingdoms is probably the only game where it showed it was possible to blend these approaches successfully, but Troy and Pharaoh revealed the dangers of copying the fantasy formula too closely. For the historical series to thrive again, especially in this next game that CA is going to be announcing at the end of the year, CA needs to return to its roots. Civilizations, not characters, shared systems with emergent outcomes, not gimmicks, and tactical battles that continue to evolve rather than stagnate. Either way, I really hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. If you did, give it a like and drop any thoughts or questions in the comment section below. Let me know what you think in terms of, exploring how Warhammer has influenced the historical side of the series, whether you agree, whether you think there are other factors that I'm missing here. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this, and thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.